Welcome to IVF This, episode 150, IVF and Time Doesn't Heal. Hello, my beautiful friends. I was just overwhelmed with humility that I just said that number 150. Like, that is absolute insanity to me. 150 podcast episodes, 150 pieces of original content. I just looked at my podcast stats last week when I first started writing this episode, and there are just under 150,000 unique downloads, which is astonishing to me. So thank you. If you're listening to this on the day the episode drops, or if you're listening to this in 3 years in the future, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being here. I do want to start this episode off with a massive shout out to my producer, Anthony. Aside from me, this wonderful human being is the reason that this podcast exists. The first time I spoke to Anthony was in like August-ish of 2020. I had this idea of the podcast and I'd reached out to some people and had been referred kind of down the line because those people weren't accepting new clients, and somehow in this wonderfully serendipitous way, I was linked up with Anthony. I want you to stay with me through this timeline because I think it'll give you some idea of how instrumental he was in the creation and continuation of this podcast. I met him well in a COVID time, like I spoke to him, right? It was over Zoom, or I think it was a phone call or something. I met him in August and we talked about my vision for the podcast and some logistical stuff, all of that. And then I pretty much ghosted him for a solid 6 weeks. I was absolutely terrified. And so I ran and I hid. And then in October, I was able to locate my big girl pants and I talked to them again. I bought my equipment. I finished writing that first episode and I started recording. And the first episode didn't even drop until November. So like August to the actual episode dropping in November, okay? I cannot describe to you how this human has proven time and time again to be as patient with me throughout the last, 3.5 years as he was in those first few months with me. I couldn't do this podcast without him. And I get an equal amount of satisfaction knowing that while he's editing and listening to this episode, he is going to be so uncomfortable and so squirmy because I am just lavishing him with compliments. And that makes it worth it to imagine him being uncomfortable. But Anthony, I adore you. I could not do this without you. Thank you for everything. Okay, onwards. So I usually have kept like the 50s episodes on more personal stuff. So at number 50, I interviewed my best friend Rachel, and we talked about our friendship and how we each navigated our own infertility and IVF journeys. Episode 100 was an interview with my love, my husband, and we talked about our journey. And so today it's going to be pretty similar. It's going to be specifically about me. And what I want to talk to you about is how life after infertility and IVF looks, or how it can look, right? Now, I want to acknowledge that right off the bat, by all accounts, we have had remarkable success throughout our IVF and infertility journey. We got pregnant spontaneously with our oldest, who will be 10 in August. We did 2 stim cycles and 3 transfers, of which 2 were successful, our 6.5-year-old and our very nearly 2-year-old. In fact, I think she'll be 2 the week after this episode drops. Now, acknowledging that we have had success and privilege in this area does not mean that we did not struggle. I've been very open about that. But as I talk about a post-IVF experience, post-family planning, I want to acknowledge that my success is not shared by all of you, right? Even though I wish to God it would be. So to set the stage, about 9 months ago, I had an endometrial ablation. I had several cycles of like weird periods and hormones, and I'm pretty sure I'm perimenopausal. And so there's there's a lot of things that were happening inside of my body a little over a year after I delivered our last baby. So I was talking to a few friends of mine. We were all kind of sharing what had been going on and what was happening in our lives. And to like everyone's surprise, she was pregnant. One of the individuals in this group that I was talking to. She's in her early 40s, and honestly, she hadn't been trying. They hadn't been actively. They had had their last child like 6 or 7 years ago. It was not really on the table. And they have had one of the roughest past 3 years of their family that I could imagine, right? And so it was, of course, celebrated. It was wonderful. But when I came home after we'd kind of all had our moment, we were all like in community and sharing and just having a good time. I was kind of reflecting back on that announcement. And even after having gone through the ablation and seeing some very glaring signs of perimenopause, neither me or my husband are interested in having any more children. And knowing the horror that that family has experienced over the last 3 years, I still felt this like twinge of pain, that old familiar twinge that happened when I would see a pregnancy or a birth announcement or something like that. Like it certainly wasn't as painful as it would have been in the past, right? It didn't evoke anywhere near the emotion that it had previously, but it wasn't nothing, right? I noticed it. So it was definitely there. And just like I tell all of you regularly, two things can be true at the same time, right? I can feel tremendous joy for them and tremendous sadness for me. Now, it wasn't sadness per se. I think it was more of like, honestly, I think it was kind of an emotional muscle memory, right? Like I remember Rachel, my best friend, and I were talking about the same thing. And so I know it's not just me, 2 years removed from it, 3 years from my last IVF cycle, but those feelings, those pangs, that yearning, that heartache still kind of hits, right? And I remember it so vividly. It was all of that experience, even though it spanned decades, it's kind of like it felt like both yesterday and decades ago, right? And just that announcement kind of brought some of that back from the recesses of my brain into my present moment. And so I was thinking about that like a lot, and I was scrolling through social media as one does, and I came across an infertility motherhood quote unquote influencer that talked about something similar, and in their caption said time heals all wounds. And it just made my skin crawl. Now, this is, I would never put this person on blast. I'm not going to mention who they were, who they are, whatever. But that phrase makes my skin crawl. And so when I was thinking about this kind of landmark episode, this another 50 in the can, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we experience that, that similar pang that I was talking about, even when we have everything that we wanted, and that it's not a bad thing, right? And so you guys know I love myth busting, and I'm going to talk about why time heals all wounds, why that phrase can actually be really detrimental to someone who's still actively going through that trauma or that pain or that experience, and what time's role actually is in the healing process. So let's start with why time heals all wounds is a relatively common phrase, and it's often attributed to the Greek poet Menander, who lived in 300 BC. And that individual wrote, "Time is the healer of all necessary evils." And it's been since used over and over in different varying ways throughout literature. And like a lot of things said to people experiencing any type of grief, breakup, death, infertility, illness, no one is immune to this, right? We can understand why it seems like a good phrase, or it seems like a truthful phrase or something like that, right? Like it holds some universal truth. It's similar to that like rage inducing phrase, stay positive. Like we understand, we can understand why it's a commonly used phrase within the infertility and IVF world, but it doesn't mean that it can't be or isn't harmful in some ways. So it's convenient just to say time heals, right? It kind of feels comforting to just imagine that all we have to do is wait and let time pass, and then we will feel better. And I get why we say it. I get that we don't want to feel bad and that we're looking for a way to feel better, or maybe an anchor in the future that we will feel better, something like that. And it feels good to think about that, right? We have confidence that time will pass. If all that we need to have happen is time to pass, then we're going to get to feel better, right? So why can't we all just get behind that? I'm all for that. I understand it. And it's been used in self-help for decades. And yet we know that if all we needed to have happen was for time to pass, then we would all make the same amount of quote unquote progress, right? We'd all be in the same place simply because time has passed. And that's not the case. We can look around and see different people in different amounts of time since their loss or since their experience, whatever their situation is. And we're all in different places. So it can't just be simply that time needs to pass for us to heal. It's not that simple, but we understand it feels good to say and it feels logical to say. It's got a nice long history. There's quotes that you can go on the interwebs or Pinterest, but it's just not an accurate representation of grief or the role of time in healing. And so I would like to propose that it can honestly be kind of damaging, right? Not always. Again, it's nuanced, it's complicated, but it can be. But when we believe that time heals, what we end up doing in grief or any experience of grief, right? I talk about infertility as a form of grief all the time. So when I talk about grief, that's what I'm referring to, right? This breach of expectations, this loss of expectations that we had, right? So what we end up doing often in our grief is kind of white knuckling the entire experience. We're just resisting it, right? We're just waiting for time to pass, being kind of a passively active participant in our healing process, but we're white knuckling it. We're just bearing down, waiting for it to happen. We end up using coping mechanisms that might help us in the short term, but might create a whole hell of a lot of suffering. And we don't necessarily want to use that in the long term. So maybe we just keep ourselves super busy so that we're distracted because we think that time will just pass and that we just have to stay busy. Distract yourself, keep yourself busy, find a hobby, blah, 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 right? We've all heard that in terms of like distracting ourselves or just kind of getting through an experience or a grief or something like that, right? My husband lost both of his parents by the time that he was 41. So just within the last few years, we lost his mother. His father died very, very unexpectedly and very suddenly. And I remember so clearly at the viewing, the day before his funeral, people would tell us just stay busy, distract yourself, etc. And it was all tied to this idea of healing. After our transfer that failed in the summer of 2020, I had a lot of people reaching out to me with messages of love and support, and several of them had some variation of the whole give yourself time, time will heal, throw yourself into your work, etc. As if you distract yourself enough, that would somehow solve for the grief that you experience. And this isn't putting anyone on blast again or anything like that. But if that is the general or cultural belief around managing grief or loss is to distract yourself, I don't know about you, but some of us eat to distract ourselves. Some of us shop to distract ourselves. Some of us drink to distract ourselves. Some of us use social media to distract ourselves, right? It's not that distracting ourselves is wrong or bad. It's just that sometimes the distraction techniques can create unintended consequences that we don't want or need in our life. And this actually happens a lot, or at least this is my hypothesis, that when we get back to back cycles, stim cycles, transfer cycles, whatever, it is in part an effort to avoid the hurt. Right? That's not the only reason that we do it, but it's a very physically, mentally, emotionally, and financially taxing experience. And one of those consequences is that we don't give ourselves time to process what we have gone through and continue to go through. thinking if we can just get to the next thing, there's an urgency there to get to the next thing, that we will feel better. Again, it's not wrong. It's just that it can create consequences that maybe we don't want. I used to talk a long time ago. I don't know why I stopped talking about it, but it's like trying to shove a ball under the water, right? If your grief is the ball and all of your distractions are in an effort to shove that ball underwater, doesn't matter how well you think you can do that. It doesn't matter how strong you think you are in holding that ball underwater. It takes a lot of effort, and it's very taxing to try and hold that ball underwater. And eventually, no matter what you do, it is going to pop up and smack you in the face. It just is, right? We eventually get tired. We eventually let go, and it comes up with a lot of force and kicks your ass, okay? And a lot of us are doing that unnecessarily because we believe in this idea of time will heal. So we're just kind of shoving it underwater, and then time is passing and we're resisting whatever it is. We're not looking at it. We're not adding energy to it. And eventually, pop, just comes up, smacks you right in the nose. So when we believe that time heals, it can make us a little more passive than we might want to be. It can make us less of an advocate for ourselves or for the kind of support we want or need than we might otherwise do if we didn't believe that time was the key to healing. If we just fully believed, I'm responsible for getting myself where I want to be now that this has happened or continues to happen, and time is not going to do this for me, we might want to be a little bit more assertive in how we advocate for ourselves, in whatever that means for us, right? Different resources for different people, all of that. But if all we think is just, well, I just got to lay low, let time pass, white knuckle it, it can make us more passive in that process. It makes us more of a bystander to our own healing. Like if time is the main thing working, then we're not really owning our part in our healing. And that was me for a very long time. I just tried to get my way through it, just muddle through. But you've probably heard me talk about it. I talk about this with my clients. I probably mentioned it on this podcast. If not, I can do a whole episode. But there's a process called the dual process of grief. And the TLDR is it dual process. So that means two things: distraction and immersion. Okay. So basically, if we can understand that that's what grieving and healing looks like, distraction and immersion, we get to use that to our advantage. But if we don't, if we're buying into the myth that time heals, then we can lean a little bit more into distraction, right? So the dual process of grief teaches that there's essentially two buckets of activity, right? There are grief-related activities and there are non-grief related activities. So there's the work of grief, quote unquote, the work of grief, and then respite, things unrelated to grief. And so oftentimes we think, I've got to do all of this work around grieving. And then we fall into this binary of, I just need to let time heal and I just need to distract myself as something magical is going to happen over that time. And really, neither one of those things are true or useful. Forcing ourselves to do the work of grief and then also going into this binary where we're just avoiding waiting for time to pass and processing and healing, both of those by themselves are not going to do it. We have to have both, which is why the dual process of grief exists, right? It teaches us that there is a back and forth. We're going to vacillate between doing the work of grieving, thinking about our loss, coming to terms with it, supporting ourselves, creating and nurturing coping skills, coping mechanisms, and stuff maybe that is more restorative. Like for me, starting IVF this was very restorative. That was part of my grieving process, right? And then we need to distract ourselves. So it's immersion and distraction, immersion and distraction. Netflix binges are distracting. Getting outside, gardening, doing things unrelated to your experience and your loss, That is part of grieving, part of healing. And then we go back and forth. We go back and forth. I often think about it as like those old silversmiths. If you've ever watched a silversmith work, they use heat to mold whatever it is that they're working on. For this, we'll talk about a sword, right? Because clearly 2024 in Austin, Texas, Emily Ginn, I have tremendous experience with swords. I don't know why this particular imagery resonates for me with this topic, but it does, right? I don't have a hell of a lot of experience with swords, but here we go. So a silversmith will use heat to mold and bang on the sword to create the sword. And then at whatever time or whatever point in the creation process, they'll put the sword in water to cool it off, right? So the molding, the banging, that part, that active part, that would be the integration, right? That's the work of grief, the work of the silversmith, right? You dunk it in the bucket of water to cool it off, to set it. That's the distraction. You can't do something like building a sword or molding a sword, anything like that. You can't do that without the existence of both things. And that's what we're talking about. You have to have both things. You cannot do the work of grieving all of the time. Your head will explode. Your brain will shut down and go into shock. You can't do that. You also can't distract yourself. I guess you can distract yourself all of the time, but then you're going to get those unintended consequences, the negative impacts of that distraction if you're not balancing both. And so that's why I think when we say this time heals thing, it makes us feel better. We've been saying it for eons, since great Greek philosophers. And I think it's just not helpful to say because it limits your involvement, your empowerment in your own healing. It makes us less likely to learn how to feel our feelings. It makes us more passive than we want to be, less able to advocate for ourselves. It reinforces that belief that we are helpless in this journey, that everything happens to us. And that's not what we're about. That is not what this podcast is about. And so that dual process of grieving, we need both, not just time. Time is going to be existing no matter what, right? Whether you're integrating or distracting, but you have to have both in order to heal. And so a little bit of a segue here, I want to really question that word, the word that we don't often question, which is healing. What does it even mean? And I talked about this in a very recent podcast episode, maybe 3 or 4 episodes before this. But sometimes I like to question the words that we just kind of throw around commonly because we don't all have the same definition of what that means, healing. So I wonder what your definition of healing is. Have you ever considered it? I know that I considered what healing was is that it would not bother me, right? If we're going back to the example that I offered at the very beginning of this episode, that I would wake up one day and pregnancy or birth announcements, shower announcements, whatever, that those would no longer impact me. They would no longer affect me negatively or otherwise, that I would almost be kind of neutral to them. And so it wasn't until later when I started practicing this dual model of grief and really focusing on my healing and what that would look like. Because if I still had that belief system that was what healing looked like, that I would not be bothered by pregnancy announcements, things that previously would have triggered me very deeply, then I would almost feel like now my life 10 years into the future from there, I would have accomplished nothing. I would not be healed as a person. And so that was one of the things that I wanted you guys to reflect back on. What does healing mean for you? 10 years down the road, what is that going to look like? What do you want your life to look like? Not just your life in terms of your family, what that's going to look like, but you, where you feel like you're healed or healing, where you feel confident and empowered. What does that look like for you? I want you to just think about that. You don't have to put pen to paper if you don't want to, but I just want you to consider for you, not just your family, what that would look like. I think typically what people think of when they think of healing is that it relates to something happening like getting a cut, right? That you get stitches on the cut and that part of your body is no longer wounded, like it didn't happen. Something broke and we fixed it, and now it was like it was before. But I don't think that that's a useful definition of healing. Now, it was my definition of healing before I started really doing work, right? That was what I thought about healing, right? Was again that it was not going to bother me. But that's not what healing truly looked like for me, right? I don't think healing is really the equivalent to the same as it was before, especially when it comes to grief and loss associated with infertility, miscarriage, IVF, things like that. We for sure are never going to be the same as we were before infertility and IVF. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to be happy. It doesn't mean that we can't love life. It doesn't mean that we can't enjoy our life in whatever that might look like. It just means that we're always changing and we're always different after the things that happen to us. Okay. And it's just the way it is to be human, right? And really, honestly, I wouldn't want to not be changed by my experience, right? And really, honestly, would I want to not be changed by this experience? No, probably not. So, the way that I want to encourage you guys to think about healing is to use that word integration. Okay. Let's use healing and integration as equivalent words, as synonymous words, which means we're not going to be the same we were before, but that we get to decide on purpose what we want to think about what has happened, what we want to think about our future, what we want to think about our family, how we want to live, considering everything that has happened or is happening right now. What we do is we get to take what has happened and we get like a new color of thread in that tapestry. We weave it into the fabric of our lives. We decide what we want to take from that information and make it mean about our lives and ourselves. We decide how to integrate this life experience into our broader life that we are cultivating and creating for ourselves. Are we going to live more aligned with certain values? Are we going to make changes in our lives? What do we want to do for ourselves? Not in service of other people, in service to us. What is our new way of being in the world? And that's what we do. That is what is integration. Now, I want to talk very quickly about the role of time in grief. Mary Frances O'Connor wrote the book, The Grieving Brain. It's a fantastic book if you're interested in learning more about that. And to put a long story short, essentially what happens as time passes is that our brain is learning and updating constantly, right? Our brain has encoded this sense of we-ness to the situation, this we-ness of our identity, right? So if we think about this in terms of infertility, our brain has spent a lot of time imagining what we, right, that we-ness, what our lives is going to look like and what our family would look like. Now, this happens on an incredibly subconscious level, but what began as imaginings morphed into expectations. And our brain codes that expectation as certainty like, right? Like a pseudo certainty, because we intellectually know it's not a certainty, it's not a given, but it feels very certain. That expectations feel very certain. So as we go through this journey and we have these losses, this disappointment, this heartache, and the family that is in our minds and our expectations in that imagining feels further and further away, our brain has to try to integrate and recode these experiences. But we still have those expectations back in the back of our brains, and we still have this yearning when we have that imagining in our lives for what our family is going to look like, for our children, for our relationship with our partner if we have one, right? But what time does is that even when we are yearning and heartbroken, even when we are still on this particular path or journey, our brain is continually learning and integrating and recoding. And that's the role of time. Just that is to integrate, to allow the time for your integration. But during all of this recoding, recalibrating, integration, we can learn how to support ourselves. New skills and building a support system throughout this godforsaken ride. It still extends those skills, those supports, that community that you can build will still exist and extend after this time is over. And that's my point. Most of us, and I know I did this, I languished for years, especially those first few years of our journey. I felt that longing, that yearning so strongly. And it wasn't until I took a really close look at my life and I saw what I could be doing during that time, right? Not what I was doing. I was doing a lot of distraction. I was doing a lot of languishing. I was doing a lot of self-criticism and shame. But I started seeing what I could be doing during that time. Of course, I wanted to be making, growing, and raising babies. But it didn't mean that my time was wasted if I was not doing those things. I could still care for myself and be loving and present to myself, my husband, and the children as I came to have them. So to say it succinctly, it's nuanced. Your grief is nuanced. Your experience is nuanced. It's complicated. To say that time heals is to grossly oversimplify grief in a way that doesn't help. Oversimplify your experience in a way that doesn't help. It's inaccurate. Grief isn't simple. It's actually incredibly messy. And more than time passing needs to happen for us to decide what we want to do and who we want to be. So let's just stop saying it. Please, let's stop saying it, because it makes it seem like you're not doing work to better yourself. And you are. By virtue of just listening to this podcast, you are. And I want you to give yourself credit for what you do and for what you're learning and for what you're applying and for what you're integrating. I want you to give yourself all of the credit because you're doing an amazing job navigating a really hard situation that has absolutely no user manual or process and procedure. And that's important work. And it's important to give yourself credit for that. And I will always honor you and your journey and your loss and your experience in the most loving way that I possibly can. And that is what I have for you this week. I hope you have a great one. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.